moving into reevaluation, continued eligibility, this is another area that has been affected by our change in the SLD eligibility criteria. Key questions that arise are, how might a triennial reevaluation be conducted for a student initially identified under the previous SLD criteria? And how is the determination of continued eligibility made and documented? Key language in the preamble to the federal regs is given here, and we have really used this language as a basis for some of our guidance around reevaluation. What this statement does is really caution states who, like Colorado, have changed their eligibility criteria in really considering what the effect of exiting a child from special ed who has received services for years, what that effect would be, what would removal of supports mean to that child. Certainly would consider whether the child's instructional and overall program has been appropriate as part of this process. You look at what's the intensity of the intervention that's been provided, what has the child needed in the way of specialized instruction. All of these things would be consideration for reevaluation or continued eligibility. When we look at triennial reevaluations, we do identify some important elements and considerations. Certainly, like any reeval, parents are team members. We need to look at existing data. We need to plan for the evaluation, what additional data is needed, and communicate that, obviously, to the parent. What we are saying, though, is that reevaluation does not necessarily have to be about reestablishing a disability, that there is some presumption that that disability is still valid unless there's data to indicate otherwise. Then we really should be looking at that data and maybe reconsidering. So continued eligibility is based on some evidence of, for example, for learning disabilities, the child still exhibits academic skill deficits. We aren't applying the new criteria and starting over, doing RTI, doing, all of that, but really looking at what's the evidence this is still a child with a learning disability, and what's the evidence that the child still needs special education and related services. So that's the focus of the reevaluation. Continued need, confirmation, identification of special needs, and changes to the IEP. So it's a shift in focus from reestablishing an identified disability. We've identified 3 triennial evaluation scenarios, and these are as reflected in the federal and state laws, that a reevaluation, first of all, may include the collection of additional evaluation data in addition to what is already existing for a child. That's probably, we think, the most typical one. It's what most of us are accustomed to, that reevaluation would include some additional assessment. Then the second one being a new provision in IDEA 2004, where there can be an agreement between the parent and the public agency that reevaluation is totally unnecessary. We are thinking that would be rare, that you wouldn't at least address a student's special ed needs and related services, look at where you are, and look at that continued eligibility for special ed and the need for it. But if a parent and the agency make this agreement, that certainly should be documented in writing. And what we're assuming is what would happen here if that agreement is in place, then the focus is just shifted to the annual review of the IEP. Here we have the third triennial scenario, where we would have reevaluation with no additional evaluation data needed. And I would think that would be more common then just determining a reevaluation is unnecessary. We would base our reevaluation on existing data. A related issue is around the documentation of evidence of a disability or accommodations needed for older students who are about to transition from high school to college. And we realize a reevaluation may not take place that last year, but whether we talk about in an evaluation report or in a present level of academic achievement, functional performance, or the required summary of performance, somewhere we need to be talking about the evidence that a student still has a disability, whether it be talking about their reading deficits or math deficits or whatever is still true of this child, so that this transition will be a smooth one. The higher ed coordinators, at least in our state, are really looking for evidence of disability. So even if you don't do further assessment, it's important to be documenting somewhere this information. In addition to the evidence of the disability still being there, would be documentation of what accommodations the student has needed in order to succeed. So that would be another thing those folks will be looking at. The next section addresses evaluation, eligibility considerations, particular to students who are culturally and or linguistically diverse. So when we're looking at SLD identification with this population of students. So a key question is, what are the unique considerations and procedures when referring, evaluating, identifying a student who is culturally and or linguistically diverse? Of course, these two factors are specifically identified in both federal and state law within the definition of a learning disability. You see what we call exclusionary factors, cultural and limited English proficiency. It certainly is critical to remember that we're looking at these factors and determining whether they are the primary reason for the learning difficulty. We are not saying that they can't coexist. These factors can coexist with an appropriate identification of SLD. It is important to be documenting student information and rationale when we're determining an identification or SLD eligibility with a student who has one of these factors. So we look for documentation such as the results of the home language survey. And if a student's primary home language is other than English, then we expect to see reference to the Colorado English Language Acquisition Proficiency Assessment that needed to have been given within 30 days. If we have a determination that a child is an English language learner, then we need information on the status of that. You know, what is their proficiency status? How long have they been receiving services? Those kinds of things. So we have developed some guiding questions when considering referral or eligibility of a student with linguistic or cultural diversity. So we're looking at, again, universal core instruction. Is it effective for most students from this demographic? How does the achievement and rate of progress differ from others within their peer group? Are interventions culturally, linguistically appropriate? Is a student, if they're an English language learner, is a student receiving targeted intervention around the academics in addition to language acquisition sorts of services? And not that an ELA teacher couldn't also be providing academic intervention. They can be. We just want to make sure that they're really receiving both kinds of service. Looking at evaluation assessment, if a child is culturally or linguistically diverse, I think it's especially important to include some of these or to address some of these elements. Parent-family interviews are always important, but especially important with students within this demographic. We need to make sure that our assessments minimize cultural bias. It's probably even more important to have informal measures to supplement those standardized ones, since the standardized assessments are not always valid and reliable for use with this population of students. Including dynamic assessment of learning, which is that actual activity where the teaching learning cycle is taking place. And it is informal, but it can be very informative of how a student learns new material. We need to look at whether we should be assessing in English, in both English and the native language, or only in the native language. We need to look at that. We need to ascertain whether errors found are typical of other students. Because if we're looking at errors that are typical of all students who are English language learners, for example, then those errors may not be indicative of a learning disability or a disability of any type. Okay, it is important, continuing with the evaluation assessment of this population of students, that we focus on educational needs rather than on perceived or inferred intellectual deficits. We do need to look at learning assets and strengths. We need to review test results of family members because they can really help us to gain additional insight as to student performance. We need to make sure that we draw attention to any departures from the standardized testing procedures and what effect that can have on interpretation. And we need to be interpreting the data within a team setting. Again, we need to consider that even if a student is determined not eligible, as we have back in slide 29, that we need to be partnering with families. We need to consider, is there some other kind of support that the child needs? We should not be, again, considering special ed as the only avenue to targeted instruction. So that whole system piece of that integration, RTI, special ed, etc., we need to be looking at that for any students. The identification of twice exceptionality has significantly changed with the revised criteria. So looking at where we might have a student who's identified as gifted who might also have a specific learning disability. The key question is, why might a student who has academic skill weaknesses in comparison to areas of strength not be eligible for special ed services in the category of SLD? It certainly is appropriate that a student may be identified as both, as gifted and truly have a specific learning disability and should receive services. However, disagreements may arise when a parent or other advocate believes that a student should be eligible for special ed, even if achieving at or near grade or age level. The common rationale there is that if, for example, a student has some really areas of great strength, that they should be performing that well in other areas in addition. Also looking at an assessment of intelligence, ability. If a student is well above average, the rationale is that the skills should also be, or the achievement of skills should also be above average. We look at the relevant change to federal language here. In IDEA 97, the 99 regs, the initial stem around determination of SLD is that a team may determine if the child does not achieve commensurate with his or her age and ability levels in one or more of the areas identified. In IDEA 2004-2006 regs, here the determination says if the child does not achieve adequately for the child's age or to meet state-approved grade level standards. So there is definitely a shift to including ability level in that comparison to not including it, age or grade level standards that we are making that comparison to. The next slide here shows relevant case law example, and basically what it is where there was a dismissal of a due process complaint where the parent disagreed with the eligibility decision where a student was found not eligible. It is based on the fact that the child who was identified as gifted did not need special education and related services to achieve adequately for the child's age or to meet grade level standards. There was no demonstrated need for specialized instruction in order to access general ed curriculum. The important consideration is how the student performs compared to age grade level peers rather than as compared to peers with similar intellectual ability. This has really caused some change in how we identify twice exceptional and not using the IQ achievement discrepancy in order to identify kids. Again, I want to bring us back to considering that even if a child is determined to not be eligible for special ed, we need to look at what were the concerns that brought the child to the table in the first place. Does the child need some kind of additional support, whether through RTI problem solving? Do we want to consider the appropriateness of a 504 plan? So we need to constantly think within the whole educational system and what a child needs. The final area I'm going to briefly touch on is the relationship between dyslexia and SLD. The key questions here are, what is that relationship between the two? And why might a student diagnosed as having dyslexia not be found eligible for special ed within the disability of SLD? This first slide speaks to the relationship piece. The term dyslexia is used in our state definition as it is used in the federal definition of SLD to include conditions such as, and dyslexia is one of those conditions. SLDs involving word-level reading deficits are cited as the most common of specific learning disabilities. Dyslexia is used by leading researchers to describe word-level reading disorders. You're looking at a common definition of dyslexia. You notice that second statement there, that it is characterized by difficulties with accurate and/or fluent word recognition, poor spelling, decoding skills, typically resulting from a deficit in the phonological component of language. So that is key. This is the basis, word-level reading disorder for dyslexia. What we do need to keep in mind is that the disability category is specific learning disability. Dyslexia is not a special ed category in IDEA or in Colorado's rules and law. Here we have been looking at students who may have an outside diagnosis of dyslexia and may not be found eligible for special education. We again should be partnering with parents and families to address the concerns that have been put on the table. We need to look at whether maybe a 504 plan would be appropriate. We need to look at whether we should be making a referral for problem solving and be providing intervention of some kind, that this is on a continuum, and the academic growth of all students needs to be supported across general, compensatory, gifted, and special education. Again, this is exactly what RTI, or multi-tiered system of instruction and support, is all about, that special education should not be the only avenue for targeted instruction, that we're part of this bigger system of student supports. The last slide that you have there just gives you our website, the SLD website again, with the postings that are there, or a sampling of the postings that are there, our guidelines, the topic briefs, a document that just contains the SLD language in the Colorado rules as well as federal regs. The SLD Fast Facts is just a quick document of our revised criteria and what that means. And various professional development documents and presentations and so forth that we have posted there. I have also given you our Colorado Department of Education RTI website, and there is a wealth of information, tools, resources, professional development opportunities, and so forth posted on that site as well.